peeps. You're listening to She's My Cherry Pie, the baking podcast from the Cherry Bomb Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jessie Sheehan. I'm a baker, recipe developer, and author of 3 baking books, including my latest, Snackable Bakes. Each Saturday, I'm hanging out with the sweetest bakers around and taking a deep dive into their signature bakes. Today's guest is Rose Levy Beranbaum. Rose is the renowned baker and award-winning author behind 12 cookbooks, including the Cookie Bible, the Bread Bible, and the Baking Bible. And the 35th anniversary edition of Rose's Cake Bible will be out this fall. Rose is known for pioneering the reverse creaming method, a revolutionary cake-making technique. And if you're like, what's reverse creaming? Don't worry. Rose joins me in just a minute to explain. We also walk through the recipe for her all-occasion Downy yellow butter cake with dark chocolate ganache frosting from the first edition of the Cake Bible, which is one of Rose's favorite cakes and might just become yours too. And we talk about her preferred method for making ganache, spoiler alert, in a food processor. To be honest, peeps, talking to Rose was totally a dream come true for me. She has been one of my baking heroes for such a long time, and it was wonderful to chat with her in the studio. Stay tuned for my chat with Rose. Thank you to Plugra Premium European-style butter for supporting today's show. As some of you know, I've been a big fan of Plugra for some time now, and was introduced to it at my very first bakery job when I was just a newbie baker. Fast forward to today, I'm a professional baker, cookbook author, and recipe developer, and I continue to rely on Plugra for all my baking needs. My fridge is always stocked with Plugra sticks and solids. I especially love that Plugra contains 82% butter fat. The higher butter fat content means less moisture and more fat, and as bakers know, fat equals flavor. Plugra butter is also slow churned, making it more pliable and easy to work with. I do a lot of baking this time of year for work and for myself and my family. Comfy bakes like my pistachio chocolate anytime buns and cinnamon sugar buttermilk donut holes, and I always reach for Plugra unsalted butter. I've also been making a lot of yeasted breads lately, and I love the buttery flavor Plugra adds to my dough. Plugra Premium European-style butter is the perfect choice from professional kitchens to your home kitchen. Ask for Plugra at your favorite grocery store or visit Plugra.com for a store locator and recipes. Peeps, the new Icons issue of Cherry Bomb's print magazine is here, and it features 3 culinary icons on the covers. Indian food superstar Madhur Jaffrey, Dr. Jessica B. Harris, and the Chinatown champion, Grace Young. Inside, you'll find stories on more incredible women in the world of food, plus recipes like Marcella Hazan's iconic tomato sauce. You can snag a copy or subscribe at cherrybomb.com, or pick up a copy at a retailer near you, like Kitchen Arts and Letters in New York City, Now Serving in L.A., Moon Palace Books in Minneapolis, and Bold Fork Books in Washington, D.C. Check out cherrybomb.com for our complete list of retailers. Let's check in with today's guest. Rose! So excited to have you on She's My Cherry Pie and to talk all-occasion Downy yellow butter cake with chocolate ganache frosting with you and so much more.
I have so been looking forward to this.
Yay! So you grew up in a home with no sweets due to the fact that your mother was a dentist. And when you went to college, you tasted your first from-scratch cake, and you knew right away that you wanted to recreate that flavor of that homemade cake, but maybe with the texture of something store-bought like you had had at a friend's birthday party. I love, love, love this story about you because I, too, whenever I am making a cake, am sort of trying to replicate that texture of something from the box with making it very homemade. And then you started writing your cookbooks, and when you were asked by a slightly critical New York Times journalist in 1988 when the Cake Bible was published, he asked, well, what have you done differently with cake? And you said, I have changed the way cakes are baked to make them faster, easier, and better. Can you tell us about that? That is so brilliant. I just love that answer.
That is spot on that you remembered that. Well, for one thing, I did get my master's at NYU in food science and culinary arts. And I actually got an A+, which they don't usually give on a master's level, because we were supposed to take a simple statement, because even the simplest statement can lead to 22 pages of conclusions. And my statement was, does sifting affect the quality of a yellow cake mix? I didn't mean a box mix, but just, we were all told, start by sifting the flour. And the first thing I always did, and ever since when I was writing, is if there's a word I'm writing about, I look it up in the dictionary. And in this case, sifting, everybody was assuming it mixes the ingredients together evenly. All it does is to aerate them so that they hydrate better. And I started coming up with all the different experiments that we could do to achieve what my goal had been, which was to have that wonderful soft texture of a cake mix from a box with the flavor of a butter cake that's homemade, that was always much coarser, but with a wonderful buttery flavor that nothing to me is equal to. Even when I make a chocolate cake with oil, I end up saturating it with ganache that has cream and butter. Of course, I didn't actually have to do the experiments. I just had to put them forth. But when I started teaching cake decorating and I wanted to have something that people would have a cake worthy of putting the decorations on, that was when I got to start experimenting. And I think it was something like 22 cakes later that I found the way to do it, which is called reverse creaming. If you look at Wikipedia, I was shocked because somebody told me, I never looked up my name. It says, first thing and only thing is she invented the reverse creaming method. And I thought, well, I didn't invent it. It's much more interesting than that. I read all these different food science books, and one of them talked about how you need high ratio shortening in order to use the commercial method, which is also called reverse creaming. Otherwise, with butter, it wouldn't emulsify because it needs to have that high ratio shortening. And they said the reason is it has to be between 65 and 75 degrees. And so I started thinking, well, what if I have butter at that temperature? Maybe that would work. Now, to this day, I will not go back to the old creaming method because you get a finer texture. I mean, I did arrive at what I wanted, so I applied it to all my cakes, including the Downy yellow all-occasion cake.
I wanted to talk about your recipe writing because recipes written by you have been described as the gold standard of recipe writing, and I've read that you have even said that your middle name could be Precision.
I don't know where you read that, but it's the absolute truth.
You were the first to include weights in the U.S. in your cookbooks and charts as well, because your trailblazing editor, Maria Guarnaschelli, who edited the Cake Bible, understood that when you give details like you were giving people, your readers will succeed. And you've even said that easy recipes, they don't have all the information necessarily that's going to make them work. Tell us about that process of you convincing Maria to let you do the weights, of how that idea came to you.
Maria was kind of an intellectual snob in the best sense of the word. I mean, she went to Yale for her graduate work, and she was also kind of a revolutionary. In fact, the amazing thing is that once she saw the difference that it makes to have weights for all ingredients, because some books did have weights for one or two, like butter, but not all of them, and especially not metric, which is so much more precise too. She said she was throwing out all her other baking books, the ultimate compliment. But she did do some wonderful baking books that she kept as well. But it was just, she was very dramatic in her way of expressing things. And I think maybe the reason that I was that, well, I'm precise by nature, but the reason that I realized how important it was to understand what the ingredients are made up of, and also to be precise about the weight, is that my late husband was a doctor and he couldn't imagine doing it by volume. And then I saw very quickly how flour, if you tried to measure it, you get 3 different results depending on how you do it. And one of those results is going to give you 1 3/4 times the amount that's intended. You know, the difference between bleached and unbleached flour is so significant, and I still see to this day people saying all-purpose flour, not specifying which they mean. And if you're making bread and use bleached, it won't be strong enough. If you're using unbleached with cake, it will be chewy, and it won't give you the same consistency. So, you know, it's just, I like to give so much information, but not all editors would have appreciated that. And I remember that one that Anne Bramson had told me I should submit the Cake Bible to her editor, and I got a rejection back. The name of my cooking school is Cordon Rose, but it was addressed to Condom Rose, and I framed it on the wall. And it said, "You throw the reader into a frenzy of contingencies that you go over their head and tell them more than they need to know. Well, it all began with the joy of cooking that I so admired, and I even have a letter from Marion Rumbauer when she was revising her book, because I had used her as an example in one of my college papers and how wonderful it was. And she said, "Thank you for encouraging me because I'm right now in a revision of the book. And now I'm in the revision of the Cake Bible." Isn't that kind of amazing?
Yeah, I had read about how you were influenced by the joy of cooking and how you appreciated all of that extra information that was included, but you were really approaching it like a user and saying, if I myself am not turning the page to get to the information that they want me to read, then no one's going to. And it's got to be right there on the page.
Yeah, I write for myself first. And the wonderful thing is that I knew nothing. If you know a little something, then you don't think of what people might need to know that they don't.
Yeah.
So it was a real advantage having had no baking background whatsoever. Also, I think my major mentor, if people were to ask who I admire most, it would be Julia Child, because she wrote that way, and it would be Madame Curie, because that was her approach. When I saw the movie, I cried because I recognized myself in the middle of the night going to the lab because she realized what the answer was, and me in the middle of the night mixing the cake and calling Woody in Minnesota and saying, "Oh my God, it rose 3 times the height." Failure after failure, and it just, I get the chills remembering all these things. I love that.
I'm getting the chills just hearing it. I also understand that perhaps your recipe writing style has changed even more recently with the inclusion of step-by-step photos to try to help people really see what you're doing, what all the steps are for the different recipes. Is that accurate?
Jessie, the thing is, I wish I could have step-by-step photos in all my books, but that would make them 2,000 pages long. The only one that I was allowed to do this in, and my husband Woody's always saying, well, if you called it a Bible, it would be selling. People don't even realize how special it is Rose's Baking Basics. And every recipe has the steps, and I refer to it because sometimes you forget the texture of what something is supposed to be like, and you see it there. It's invaluable. Yeah. But nowadays, people can do a lot of video. And it's not quite the same because with video it goes so fast. True, you can stop it. But while you're baking, you don't want to do that. Your hands are grimy. Whereas with a book, you can have it right there, open, and it makes it much easier.
I find it so helpful. I think so many of us are visual learners, and it is so hard to read a complicated instruction about how something's supposed to be done. I think maybe particularly with bread or maybe a sophisticated pastry, etc., puff pastry, to be able to see that when they mean, a letter fold, which obviously you and I know what a letter fold is, but it can be a little complicated when you're trying to explain it, and to be able to see that in a book makes...
Yeah, instructional writing is the hardest, as you know yourself as a cookbook author. I mean, it's fun to write stories, and I love writing the head notes. I always save that for the end. I always hope there's room for them.
Yes, I was just going to say that I've read that you actually love the head notes the most, where you can put your technical info in your sidebars, but your stories in your head notes.
I'm a storyteller.
Yeah.
And that's why my next book is going to be Ma Vie en Rose.
I love that, the memoir.
Life. Yeah.
I cannot wait.
It's not exactly a tell-all, though. I'm only going to tell mostly the good stuff.
Oh, I want to read it all. I want you to put all of it in.
Well, and then I'll have to go and hibernate somewhere.
I know you're working on the new edition of the Cake Bible. Can you tell us a teeny bit about what's different about it and when we'll be seeing that book?
Well, thank you. The pub date is October 22nd, and I've been avoiding doing this, and my late husband said, it's a classic, why would you touch it? But my husband Woody has been pushing me because he keeps saying, well, so much has changed. The size of the pans, they're not 1.5 inches high anymore, they're 2 inches, and now there's something called unbleached cake flour, which isn't cake flour really at all, and you have to explain all this new stuff. I thought, okay, I would not do that if not for him, because my first thought was I'd have to change all the photos because they don't have the plates anymore. And I did every single cake and brought it across Houston Street to the studio when the guy was available to take the photograph. And it was so much work, and I didn't want to have to do it. But the fact that I knew with somebody who'd worked with me for all these years, like it's now 20 years, understands exactly what my thinking is. And it's really written by both of us. It's really done by both of us. Plus, I no longer want to have things like the rose lattice cake where you pipe meringue into little panels. And I remember holding it as I was about to cross Houston Street, and a truck went by and the panels all cracked in the back. It's like, who does that anymore, right? And we had enough panels so we could show it. It's beautiful. But I'm more now into just sheer deliciousness and simplicity.
Mm-hmm. I love that.
My recipes are complicated enough maybe, but Actually, there's plenty of ones that are pretty easy to do. It's not because they're long and informational that they make it difficult. On the contrary, they're long because they have all the information so that people can follow it and succeed.
We'll be right back.
Hi, everybody. This is Kerry Diamond, founder of Cherry Bomb Magazine and host of Radio Cherry Bomb. Today's episode of She's My Cherry Pie is presented by Nonino, the legendary family-owned Italian company from Friuli Venezia Giulia, founded in 1897 and known for its award-winning grappa. Since 1940, Nonino has been led by 6 generations of incredible women, starting with the matriarch, Silvia Nonino, who was Italy's very first female master distiller and the first woman in the country to manage a distillery. L'Aperitivo, Nonino's botanical aperitif, is based on an original recipe of Silvia's. In 1973, her daughter-in-law, Genola Nonino, helped introduce the world to the first single varietal grappa. Genola's 3 daughters, Elisabetta, who is the CEO today, Antonella, and Christina, run the distillery. They revisited their family recipes to create Amaro Nonino, the bittersweet herbaceous liqueur that is beloved by the world's top mixologists, and an essential ingredient in the famous paper plane cocktail. And then there's Francesca Nonino, Genola's granddaughter, who is Nonino's global brand ambassador and helps out in the distillery. That is an incredible family tree. Visit grappanonino.it for recipes and information on Nonino's grappa varieties. That link is in our show notes.
Now back to our guest. So now I want to talk about all-occasion Downy yellow butter cake. And you have said that this cake and frosting recipes that we're about to discuss exemplify the secret to your success, which is, if anyone says something can't be done, your immediate response is, why not? And in fact, your grandmother used to say that you had a face like a question mark, which I just loved. And were there these questions behind the creation of this cake when you were wondering maybe about that reverse creaming? Is that what you meant when you described this cake that way?
Yeah, and what my grandmother, all these years, I thought she meant because I have a big forehead and a pointy chin. And suddenly when people have been accusing me of asking questions, I thought, but that's knowing the right questions to ask is the key to life. I mean, more and more I see that.
Yes.
And not just for the cake, but also for the ganache. Mm-hmm. Because when I went to Switzerland years ago, and in this country, nobody had ever heard of ganache. They thought of, well, it's the ultimate nash, It's like nascherai. It's a Yiddish word, but it's actually a German word, and it's pronounced ganache, which I didn't know. And they said you cannot do it except by putting it in a double boiler, or by cooking it really slowly directly on the heat. And most of the time, if you're not really careful, the cream would separate out and the fat would be at the top and you couldn't get it back in. And I thought, I wonder if the food processor would work. But I was at this lecture where Laura Brody, who wrote Growing Up on the Chocolate Diet, somebody said, can you do it in the food processor? And she said, no, you can't, but ask Rose. I only pretend to know the answers. I mean, she was always so out there, out front. And so I asked Rose of myself, thinking, why can't it be? Let me try it. And it was infallible. You never had it separate. The only time it will separate is if you stir it when it's at 90 degrees. You have to let it cool to below 90, and then you can stir it. That's what I found out so much about chocolate. But this is probably the ultimate chocolate frosting. It is. I mean, it's just the best chocolate and cream. The tricky thing is, though, that people are into high ratio, high cacao chocolates because they want it to be less sweet. So I remember the producer of my PBS show wanted to impress me when I came to San Francisco, and she'd made a cake, and her husband said, you're going to need a hacksaw to cut through the frosting. I said, well, what did you do? Didn't you follow the recipe? She said, yes, but I wanted to use the best chocolate, so I used 72%. That's why now in my books I say, if you use 72%, this is how much cream you'll need. If you use 80%, this is how much more. There's just so much to know, and it's so disappointing when you have a ganache, even that's nice and soft enough to cut, but it lifts right off the cake. So these are the kinds of things that I try to address.
All right, so first things first, we're going to preheat our oven to 350 degrees for at least 20 minutes, which I think is such a great note just to remind people that it takes ovens a long time to preheat. And you have to use your oven thermometer if you have it. And we're going to place our oven rack in the lower third of the oven. We're going to coat the bottom of 2 9x2-inch round pans. Do you have a favorite brand of pan?
I love
Rose?
the USA pans.
The USA, I like those too.
But I still like to use a spray with Baker's Joy.
Oh yeah, no, I have that. what I had is actually that you like to first coat the bottom with shortening, then line with parchment, paper rounds, and then coat the paper and sides with the baking spray with flour. Is that correct?
Yeah. With Genoise, I don't coat the parchment because that way it can peel off the crust, which is great because you're going to saturate with syrup. But I want to keep every part of the basic yellow.
Why the shortening? Like, why wouldn't you maybe do the spray, then do the paper, then spray again? Why the
it
shortening?
Slips when you put it in.
Yes.
Woody chooses to do it that way because he thinks it's more efficient, but then you have to be careful when you're spreading the dough.
But you're so right that
batter.
Sometimes that piece of parchment is like swimming a little or skating a little over the spray. Oh, that's so interesting. And then we're going to encircle the outer sides of our pans with cake strips. First, can you tell for those listeners that don't know what a cake strip is, what it is and why we like them? And also, is there a favorite brand?
Yeah, mine.
Yes.
Yeah, well, the whole thing is a very interesting concept because cakes so often, no matter how you adjust the ratio of ingredients, they rise more at the side. They set at the side, and then the center continues baking because the sides are against the metal, and it gets the heat first. So it's set, it can't rise anymore. The middle of the cake domes, so you don't get a nice flat surface. And sometimes you want a slight dome, but you really don't want a huge dome. So I didn't invent this initially. There were like a material that's used for ironing boards, sort of metallic and cotton, and you soak them so that it kept the outside of the pan cool before it set so that the center caught up with the sides. And they got pretty ratty looking pretty quickly. And I was a representative in Barcelona for Le Quay Silicone, and they had a silicone cake pan. And I said to Whitty one day, I have an idea. Silicone, having worked with it, is a very poor conductor. So let's put it to an advantage. Let's cut out the bottom of the cake pan and just wrap the metal pan with the silicone that remains. And eureka, it just worked perfectly.
Oh, my gosh.
So it's on Amazon, by the way.
Amazing.
And it really does work.
Amazing. I love the idea of using the things that are not good about silicone to your advantage. So we're going to whisk room temperature egg yolks. And do you separate your egg yolks by hand? Do you like to use the shell?
Oh, that's another big issue. I learned at James Beard, he uses the hand because it's the least chance of cracking the yolk.
I use the hand.
Yeah. Oh, good. I knew we were kindred
I'm pro
spirits.
hand.
The only problem is that when the eggs are a little old, no matter how you do it, the yolks tend to break.
So we're going to whisk our room temp egg yolks that we've separated by hand, or not. We're going to add milk, which is room temperature or not. Does it matter if
I don't think it really cares.
Okay.
You want the finished temperature of the batter to be around 70 degrees, and I don't take that temperature.
Okay.
But I'm just saying you'll get that if everything else is room temperature.
Perfect. And I love this, that you can actually substitute buttermilk if you want in this cake. But I wondered, will that change the texture of the cake? Will it give it a slight tang? I just wondered about your offer of buttermilk and why you're offering it to us.
I actually love the flavor it gives. And it may be slightly finer in texture, though I can't imagine it being any finer than it is already. But with buttermilk, I worked at Procter & Gamble once years ago, and I got to speak to the head scientist. And he explained to me that buttermilk, when you put it in a mixture, it's not acidic. If the mixture is acidic, it will moderate it more toward base. And if it's base, it will make it more toward acidic. And here are all these recipes saying when you use buttermilk, you have to use baking soda to neutralize it. Not, because it takes away the flavor. So this was a real mind-blowing experience. And
Rose, you are blowing my mind right now. That was going to be my next question. Because you're saying we can use buttermilk, but you're not saying we have to use soda.
No, it's better not to.
Oh, my gosh.
Isn't that thrilling?
Listeners, listen up. Rose is dropping science. That's amazing.
This is how science, the lessons in chemistry.
Yeah.
This is how science enables you to produce and create the most amazing things. And that was asking questions. When I was at Procter & Gamble, I said, is there somebody who can explain to me about how to get the most flavor out of cocoa? And they said, that would be our head scientist. He's up in like a castle in the sky there. Nobody ever wants to talk to him. He's an old man. He'll love that you come and talk to him. So I went and I asked my question. And that's when I found out also that cocoa has like a cell around each little powder of the cocoa.
Yeah.
And if you put boiling water in it, it ruptures that outside cell, which you can't see, of course, and the flavors come out.
Blooming.
So that's why I now always add boiling water when I can in a recipe. Yeah. So it's just so moving to think about how It's an ongoing chain of helping people and knowledge and all the things that can make your baking life better.
Incredible.
And when you make your baking life better, your life is better, because I'm convinced that people who bake are happier.
We're whisking our yolks, our milk, or buttermilk, and we're adding a generous tablespoon of vanilla. I wondered if you had a favorite brand or if you make your own.
I don't make my own because I've tried and I find that the brands that exist are really superior.
Nice. Do you have a favorite?
Several. I loved Halela, the vanilla queen. Pure vanilla extract is the key.
I love it. So we're lightly whisking all of this in a 4-cup glass measuring cup with a spout. Now we're going to do something called reverse creaming, which is a technique you pioneered, whereby we're going to add our butter, and in this recipe, a little bit of milk to our dry ingredients. And for those that don't know, can you explain reverse creaming?
It's combining the dry ingredients first, so that way you don't have to sift, and sifting doesn't uniformly incorporate them. That's where it all started. The sugar, the leavening, the salt, and the flour. And you mix it together, and that way they are evenly mixed. And then you add part of the milk or buttermilk or whatever you're adding, and you beat it until it's well incorporated. And then you add the remaining egg, which is beaten with.
And we also
liquid.
add the butter, yes, along with the milk.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yes, of course. That's the whole point.
Yeah.
Because after you mix together the dry ingredients and you add the butter, then the butter gets coated with some of the flours, so it doesn't develop as much gluten. It protects it from getting chewy. So you could beat it longer without risking that it's going to get too tough.
In reverse creaming, do you always add a teeny bit of the liquid for the cake recipe along with the butter?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
I wasn't sure. For some reason, I had it in my head that it was just the butter and the dry ingredients, but it's a tiny bit of liquid as well at that point.
Yeah, just
Okay.
maybe a quarter of the
Yep.
liquid, which I don't weigh. I just do by eyeball.
Yep.
And then you add the egg and the rest of the liquid and the vanilla in 2 parts or 3 parts, depending on how long.
Yep. Just a quick question about that. Does reverse creaming work in traditional cakes calling for butter or shortening? Would you do it with an oil-based cake, or do you just do it with butter?
Well, I don't use shortening in a cake.
Let's say someone wanted to.
It would work just fine
Okay.
with shortening. That's the thing. Oil cakes are totally different.
Yeah. Okay. Good to know.
Although I do like a bit of oil in some of my butter cakes now.
Yes.
Because
To
it
add
keeps
a
it
little
moisture.
bit, and a longer shelf, like it can sit on the counter and still remain moist.
But it doesn't work for everything.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to, the proof is in the pudding. You have to
Yeah.
try things. Theory is one thing, but when you actually make the recipe, you see there may be a benefit, but also a detriment.
Yep. In a bowl of a stand mixer fitted with a flat beater, we're going to mix cake flour, superfine sugar. Tell us why you love superfine as opposed to granulated.
Well, you get a slightly finer texture, but the truth is that with granulated is pretty fine too. I don't think most people would know the difference.
Okay, great. And then we're going to add baking powder. And this particular recipe calls for a lot. It's 5 1/3 teaspoons of baking powder. And this is where I wrote, and even when you use buttermilk, you're still using, you add even a little bit more baking powder, up to 8 teaspoons of baking powder.
Is that what I said?
Yeah, which I love.
Thank you for reminding me.
I loved. And I also had this question. I'm so wedded to this idea that 1 cup of flour is leavened by 1 teaspoon of baking powder or 1/4 teaspoon of soda. And it's like you're knocking all this on its head and using extra baking powder in this recipe to get the lift that you want.
And it also depends on the kind of flour you use. But my basic ratio is for 100 grams of cake flour, which would be a cup, sifted into the cup. I use 1 1/3 teaspoons of baking powder. But I've been giving the weights now for baking powder only for people who have a scale that's set super sensitive, because baking powder is the only ingredient I have that changes every single time you do. And I worked with somebody to produce the perfectly even and reliable measuring spoons, and still it's different.
I know.
So, it's crazy making.
Yeah.
Salt is always the same.
Yeah.
6 grams per teaspoon. I finally took the weight of baking powder over a period of a year, and it averages at 4.5 grams. And I tested everything that way, and I'm just hoping that, but what I tell people in the book too is go by the results. If you find you're getting a big dome, even with the strips, then add more baking powder. If it's dipping a bit and you're using bleached flour, then use less.
Yeah.
You have to adjust it according to your measuring spoons.
Yeah. Cake flour is always bleached or always unbleached, or it can be either?
No, the trouble is now that it is becoming available as unbleached, and it does not perform the same way at all. I mean, it dips in the center. It's coarser. I've tested it.
Yeah.
No, bleached cake flour.
All right, so we've got our cake flour, we've got our baking powder, we've got some fine sea salt. Do you not use kosher?
Well, I now am starting to use kosher because it's less expensive, but I have to use double the amount, and I have to use diamond crystal.
Yes.
But I don't think it's better in any way. It's just, I think most people probably are using kosher, and therefore I wanted to educate people about it, because there are two different kinds of kosher salt. The diamond crystal is the one that's about half the weight of
you don't
sea
want to
salt.
use Morton.
No, because Morton is, diamond is actually produced in a way that's hollow. It's fluffed up. So Morton would be much too salty.
All right, so now we're going to mix our salt, our baking powder, our flour on low speed for 30 seconds. We're going to add some room temp unsalted butter and some milk. We're going to mix on low speed until the dry ingredients are moistened. We're going to raise the speed to medium and beat for 1.5 minutes. Scrape down the sides of the bowl. Are we scraping? Do you like a silicone spatula?
Yeah.
We're starting on low speed. We're going to gradually add that egg yolk mixture that we made to the batter in 3 parts, beating on medium speed for 20 seconds after each addition to incorporate the ingredients. I loved this. I found a video of you making the Downy yellow cake from many years ago. And you do this thing where you put plastic wrap on top of the stand mixer to stop like flour and whatever it is.
Yeah, because if you put a towel on top, it sticks to the towel.
Yes.
And with a plastic wrap, you see what's going on. Plus, it comes right off.
We're on medium speed for about 20 seconds after each addition. Once everything's been incorporated, do we kind of mix everything together to sort of strengthen and get the structure at the end of the final mixing?
No, because that's the final mixing.
Okay, the final mixing is
the
just
important thing is to scrape the sides because it does jump up.
Okay, great.
And to reach down to the bottom.
Right. Yeah, because of that lip or that nipple at the bottom of the stand mixer bowl. So now we're going to scrape the batter into our prepared pans. We're going to smooth the surface evenly with a small offset. I assume you probably have a large offset collection. And each pan will be about halfway full. We'll bake for 30 to 40 minutes or until golden brown. It says a wire cake tester inserted in the center will come out clean. The cakes spring back when pressed lightly in the center. And the cakes may rise a little above the side of the pan, but will sink even to the sides with a slight dome once cooled.
I just remember that this kind of validates the reverse creaming method.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought of it before for a long time, but most cake recipes say 2/3 full, and then it rises to the top. Most of my cakes, basic cakes like this, half full, and they rise to the top.
Yeah.
And yet they have an even texture.
Yeah.
Because it may seem like it's rising higher when it rises above the pan, but if it domes, what value is that? You have to cut off the dome.
Yeah. Yeah. So smart. Is there a brand of wire cake tester that you love? What should we be picturing? Sort of just like a long, skinny...
Yeah, skinny.
And then it has
I have gotten mine, it's a miracle I have not lost them about 30 years ago or more.
Yeah.
But you see, it's different from a toothpick. Some of my cake recipes are so moist that you need to use a wooden toothpick because a metal one would just slide in and out and still not be done.
Yes.
And I even like to sometimes tell people first time they're baking something to take the temperature.
Yeah. Yeah.
So around 190 is basic.
I don't even like toothpicks because they're too short. I actually love those long wooden skewers. And I like the texture because I like to pull cakes when they're still crumbs. I don't like it to be clean.
Especially chocolate ones.
Yes, exactly.
I like slightly underbaked, but I don't like underbaked yellow cake.
Yeah. I get it. I love this note, too. The cakes will only start sort of shrinking a little from the sides of the pan after you remove them.
Yeah, because if they shrink before, it may be a little bit dry, but it'll be still good the first day. Yeah. It won't have as long a shelf life.
Yeah. Now we're going to let the cakes cool in the pans on a wire rack for 10 minutes. We'll run a small metal spatula between the sides of the pans and the cakes. This is a note, pressing firmly against the pans. Is that so that your spatula doesn't cut into the cake?
Exactly.
Yeah, I loved that note. I'm always mistakenly carving out the side of my cake because I'm like...
I do that when I'm in a rush.
Yeah, exactly.
But actually, we're using Baker's Joy, or you can even use Crisco and flour and knock it out.
Yeah.
But whatever you do, you shouldn't have to really scrape against the sides of the pan.
Now we're going to invert the cakes onto wire racks, which are lightly coated with nonstick cooking spray, and that's just because you've had the experience of popping them out and then they kind of stick to the cooling rack.
They can, but if you use your racks often enough, even when you wash them,
it stays
generally
on there a little bit.
I get lazy about doing that.
We're going to peel off the parchment, and to prevent splitting, we're going to re-invert the cakes so the tops are up. How does that preclude splitting?
Because there's always a slight dome in most baked cakes. And if it's staying on its top side when you invert it, then the pressure makes it split.
Now we're going to make our ganache frosting, and We talked about this a little bit, but your choice of chocolate percentage-wise is about 62% because any higher is going to be a little too bitter and would require more cream, as we talked about. The best ratio is about 12 ounces of chocolate, about 2 cups to about 2 cups of cream. But if it's a higher cacao percentage, you're going to need more cream, which is, I hope listeners are understanding how brilliant all this science is that Rose is dropping here. Your favorite ganache for this yellow cake is a milk chocolate one. And it occurred to you one day that milk chocolate is simply a blend of dark and milk solids. So why not create your own custom blend combining white chocolate? Because is white chocolate sort of the equivalent of those milk solids?
Exactly.
With dark chocolate.
It's 1/3 milk solid, 1/3 sugar, and 1/3 cocoa butter.
Right. So you say that means that there's less sugar and more cocoa butter. So in the end, it's going to require a little less cream. And it would be the most, to quote you, luscious of all ganache. Perfectly balanced, rich, and creamy. So we're going to process some white chocolate containing cocoa butter. Is there a brand of chocolate that you like to use?
I mean, there are many wonderful ones out there, and especially commercially, but the ones that are most available to the consumer that I really love are Valrhona and Guittard. And even within that, they have different varieties of white chocolate.
Yeah. So we're going to process our white chocolate and our 60 to 62% dark chocolate in a food processor until very fine. In a 2-cup microwavable glass measuring cup with a spout or a small saucepan over medium heat, stirring often, we'll heat our cream just to a boil. Do we want to see bubbles?
Yeah, I used to say just scald it and have bubbles around the edge, but I've discovered that you can see bubbles around the edge and it's still not hot enough, and then it doesn't melt all the chocolate. So now I just say boil it. I mean, I was worried about denaturing this flavor of the cream by boiling it.
Yep.
But let's face it, the cream we get now is so denatured it won't hurt. I mean, imagine making it with unpasteurized, or at least not ultra-pasteurized cream. You get even more flavor.
Yeah.
Then you would bring it to a boil. In France, they bring it to a boil. At least when I studied at Le Notre, they brought the cream to a boil 3 times to make sure that it wouldn't make anybody sick, that it would pasteurize it, sterilize it. And now I see no point in bringing it to anything, to a boil. It's already been boiled through ultra-pasteurization. But you bring it to a boil just so that you can make sure it's hot enough, and I don't think it will change the flavor since it's already been so denatured by the boiling.
So with the motor running, we're going to pour our cream through the feed tube in a steady stream, process for a few seconds until smooth. Is there a rest at this point or no? Like, do we pour the cream in and let it rest on top?
No, there's enough cream so that you don't... For a glaze, there's less cream, and therefore you have to let it sit.
But for this, because it's a frosting.
It will just emulsify. I mean, it'll be a perfect, beautiful texture.
So we're going to pour in a steady stream, process for a few seconds until smooth, scraping the sides of the bowl as needed. Then we're going to press our ganache through a fine mesh strainer.
Surprisingly, it makes a difference in the sheen.
Yeah, explain.
I don't know chemically why that works, but it's something about with the chocolate and everything getting more finely emulsified, I suppose.
Yeah.
That I've seen the difference.
Wow.
Otherwise, it's perfect texture as it is. You wouldn't know the difference, but when it sets, it's shinier.
Well, it's so interesting because I was going to ask you why you do that, like what we were worried about that was in there that we needed to strain, but it's a textural thing. So interesting. And we're going to scrape any mixture clinging to the underside of the sieve into the bowl, and then we'll let it sit for 1 hour. Then we're going to cover with plastic wrap and let cool on the counter, right? We're not refrigerating this for about 2 to 3 hours until the mixture reaches this soft frosting consistency.
And sometimes it can be a lot sooner. I find that in the past, I've been using frosting cakes with ganache after it gets firm, and it's harder to get beautiful swoops. So as soon as you're able to do it, go for it.
Go for it. And now we frost our cake. In the same YouTube video where I saw you wrap your mixer in plastic wrap, in the YouTube video, you show us how you hold the cake in one hand and you do dollops of frosting sort of all around the side, spreading each dollop individually to avoid your spatula hitting the cake at all because you don't want to bring in any crumbs. And this technique allows you to skip a crumb coat. So I had 2 questions. Do you still hold the cake when you frost? A, and B, do you still tell people that they don't need to crumb coat if they use a technique like this?
I think it's probably not a good idea to hold it in your hand like that. And it's probably safer to do a crumb coat than try to avoid. The only way to avoid doing the crumb coat is by putting an excess amount in and then wiping it off. And that way you're not lifting off your crust. And if you do get crumbs in the frosting of whatever sort, you can just coat the frosting with nuts, chopped nuts, so nobody sees it.
Yum, 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 yum. once you frost it, do you let it set or do you serve it right away?
I let it set.
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing after several hours the difference it makes.
Yeah.
But if you haven't used enough cream, it lifts off the cake, and that's when you want to serve it right away before that happens.
I wanted to just talk about any additional cake recipes from the new edition of the Cake Bible that might be your favorite. I know you have a special place in your heart for your Downy yellow cake, but is there another favorite in the new book or in the original?
Yeah, I would say the chocolate cake, the chocolate domingo.
Can you tell us about it?
Well, it has the most butter of any chocolate cake that I could work into it. And in the new edition, the difference is that this is made with sour cream. And my protege, David, had said to me, using sour cream in the butter cake the way you do it is so wonderful. Couldn't you do it in a chocolate cake? And I said, I'm not sure it would work. Well, it did, but I always had this little dark line at the bottom. I could never get it 100% perfect. About 2 years ago, it suddenly occurred to me, actually, Woody was the one who said, why don't you eliminate some of the sour cream and replace it with the water? Oh, no, I want the full flavor of the sour cream. And then I realized it was a half a cup plus 1 tablespoon of sour cream. Why didn't I just take out the 1 tablespoon? It won't matter. Bring it to a boil. It'll be enough to hydrate the cocoa. And then what I do whenever I hydrate cocoa is I add any oil. In this case, there's no oil, but that's just an extra tip. I put the oil in it so that it floats to the top and keeps it from evaporating, because cocoa, when it's hydrated, evaporates so easily. You have to either cover it immediately with plastic wrap, or if there's oil in the recipe, like in a chiffon, cover it right away. Okay, but in this domingo, it not only makes it better texture, but you don't get that line anymore, and it still has the most full flavor of any chocolate cake in the book. And it's dedicated to Placido Domingo.
I was going to ask what the name is. Does it also have a chocolate frosting?
It doesn't actually need a frosting at all because it has that much butter, but that doesn't stop me. So my favorite frosting is what I call wicked good ganache. I was listening to the Today Show one morning while doing my back exercises, and they were talking about the show Wicked. And I thought, oh my God, that's the perfect name for my ganache, because I used chili pepper in it. And what it does is it gives a long finish, like a wine. When you're done eating, you still taste it longer. And it's not for people who don't like hot chili. I mean, you wouldn't know, it's not unpleasant. You wouldn't know this chili. Just it gives you a sensation of more fullness of the chocolate flavor.
Thank you so much for chatting with me today, Rose. And I just want to tell you that you are my cherry pie.
Thank you. And cherry pie is my favorite.
That's it for today's show. Thank you to Plugra Premium European Style Butter and Nonino for their support. Don't forget to subscribe to She's My Cherry Pie on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen, and tell your pals about us. She's My Cherry Pie is a production of the Cherry Bomb Podcast Network and is recorded at CityVox Studio in Manhattan. Our producers are Kerry Diamond, Catherine Baker, and Elizabeth Vogt. Our associate producer is Jenna Sadhu, and our content operations manager is Londyn Crenshaw. Thank you so much for listening to She's My Cherry Pie, and happy baking!